Hello, and thanks for stopping by. First published in December 1843, A Christmas Carol is, by far, the most widely adapted of Charles Dickens's many works. Stage versions of the story started to appear within just a few weeks of its initial publication, whilst the earliest attempts at TV dramatisations were first broadcast way back in the 1940s, and small screen versions continue to be commissioned to this day, like this BBC adaptation from 2019, part of which was filmed at the Lord Leicester Hospital in Warwick, an incredible building which was constructed between the late 14th and early 15th centuries. As for film adaptations, well, they have a very long history indeed. The first incarnation was shot over 120 years ago, and in this video, I'd like to take you on a tour of the various locations in the UK which have been used in movie adaptations of A Christmas Carol, namely a collection of sites in London, Shropshire and Northamptonshire. We'll begin first though by looking at some of the earliest dramatisations of Charles Dickens's famous festive tale. It took Charles Dickens just 6 weeks to write A Christmas Carol, and when he did so, he was living in London at No. 1 Devonshire Terrace, a now long lost address which stood here, on the corner of Marylebone High Street and Marylebone Road. Unbelievably, Dickens's former home was demolished in the 1950s to make way for this office block, which is now occupied by the Cavendish Health Centre. Although some concession to the site's historical importance was made with the inclusion of this mural dating from 1960, which depicts the great author alongside several of the characters he dreamt up at Devonshire Terrace, including Ebenezer Scrooge and Jacob Marley. It's also worth noting that Devonshire Terrace stood next door to St Marylebone Parish Church, and it wouldn't surprise me if this provided Dickens with some inspiration when writing A Christmas Carol. Specifically, the scene in which the ghost of Christmas yet to come confronts Scrooge with his own gravestone, something we'll be seeing more of later. Charles Dickens had two motivations for writing A Christmas Carol. The first was, as with much of his work, the desire to push a social message. Secondly, well, he was strapped for cash. His latest novel, The Life and the Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, was performing poorly, which was something of a worry, as he and his wife Catherine had a fifth child on the way, a son they would name Francis. Once complete, A Christmas Carol was published by Chapman and Hall, who are based at 186 Strand. Their office used to stand here, on what's now the site of this large block known as the 180 Studios. The book was an instant success, shifting 6,000 copies on its first day, the 19th of December 1843, alone, and it's remained in print ever since. So popular was A Christmas Carol in fact, that by February 1844 it had already been adapted for the stage. That month, 3 separate productions premiered in London, one at the former Surrey Theatre, which stood at the southern end of Blackfriars Road, beside St George's Circus, another at Sadler's Wells, and the third at the Adelphi, which was the only one officially sanctioned by Dickens. At around the time of the book's 10th anniversary, Dickens put together a specially abridged version of A Christmas Carol, which he gave a public reading of at Birmingham Town Hall on the 27th of December 1853. A review in the Birmingham Journal described the event. What a grand, fine-looking party it was. The lights were so brilliant, and the drawing room so gay, and the holly so tastefully wreathed, that there could be no mistake about this being Christmas. Then the host himself arrived, and took his place in his big armchair, and told us that we may laugh and cry as much as we wanted. Although he'd performed in plays prior to this was the first time Charles Dickens had conducted a solo public reading from one of his own books, and many more recitals would follow, his lively performances becoming as celebrated as his written work. Dickens held a great affection for Birmingham. Following his reading of A Christmas Carol, the town, Birmingham became a city in 1889, gifted him a ring, which he wore in his right hand for the rest of his life, stating, "Its grasp will keep me in mind of the good friends that I have here, and in vivid remembrance of this happy hour." The very first adaptation of A Christmas Carol, which was known both as Scrooge and Marley's Ghost, was released way back in November 1901. For the time, this was a highly ambitious undertaking, condensing the story into just a few minutes and utilising special effects to create the phantoms, which to audiences at the time must have been a wonder to behold. Marley's Ghost was also the very first movie to use intertitles, captions between scenes, which would have become a staple of silent cinema. Directed by Walter R. Booth, this pioneering adaptation of A Christmas Carol was shot in the purpose-built studios of Paul's Animatograph Works, which were named after the company's founder, Robert Paul, and located towards the northern end of London's Muswell Hill, on a patch of land bordered by Colney Hatch Lane, Newton Avenue, and Sydney Road. Other early film adaptations of A Christmas Carol included Scrooge, or Old Scrooge as it was known in the US, which was made in 1913, and opens with a shot of Charles Dickens' birthplace on Old Commercial Road in Portsmouth, and the 1923 version made by the rather grandly titled British and Colonial Kinematograph Company, who are based in Walthamstow. From this point on, we'll be focusing on 3 versions of A Christmas Carol, which, in my opinion, are the best ones out there. These are 1951's Scrooge, starring Alistair Sim as Ebenezer, 1984's A Christmas Carol, which stars George C. Scott, and was shot entirely on location in the beautiful Shropshire town of Shrewsbury, and yes, I know it can also be pronounced Shrewsbury, you can argue that out in the comments, and the 1999 version of A Christmas Carol, which stars Patrick Stewart in the lead role. And do you know what? As an extra stocking filler, I'll even throw in a bit of the Muppet Christmas Carol for good measure too. Charles Dickens begins his story by stating that Jacob Marley, Scrooge's old business partner, was dead to begin with. There is no doubt about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Marley was as dead as a doornail. Marley died in fact on Christmas Eve, exactly 7 years before the events of A Christmas Carol take place. Yet his name remains on the weathered old sign outside Scrooge's business, the old miser being too stingy to update it. The 1984 film opens with Marley's hearse rolling through the city, represented by Shrewsbury's main square, with the old market hall on the right, whilst the 1999 adaptation begins with the funeral service itself. These scenes were filmed at St Michael and All Angels Church in Waddenhoe, a tiny village which lies between Northampton and Peterborough. St Michael and All Angels is very old indeed. It can trace its history back to the 13th century. Dickens also tells us that Scrooge signed the register recording Marley's burial. We see Patrick Stewart's Ebenezer doing just that, and that Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. In the Victorian era, change was a shortened way of referring to the Royal Exchange, the purpose-built commercial centre which lies in the heart of London's financial square mile. Today, this grand building, which in its current form dates from the 1840s, is occupied by a luxury shopping centre. Ebenezer Scrooge would have indeed conducted business on the floor here, and the 1951 film opens with an exterior shot of this very building, the grumpy old miser being approached on the steps by a desperate client, who of course is viciously dismissed.
Why should she go to a debtor's prison anyway? She didn't borrow the £20, you did. What has your wife got to do with it? Let Mary, what have I got to do with it? Good afternoon.
But Mr. Scrooge, it's Christmas!
Although he doesn't state the exact address, Dickens infers that Scrooge's freezing cold counting house is off of Cornhill, opposite the ancient tower of a church with a gruff old bell, which is most likely St Michael Cornhill, making Newman's Court, located right opposite the church, a good contender for the site. In the 1951 film though, the location used for Scrooge's office is on Cathedral Street, SE1, close to Borough Market, the cathedral in question being Southwark Cathedral. As you can see, the site has been heavily redeveloped since then, and at the time of filming this video, more building work was underway, although at least the cobbled street still looks the same. Although there are no real-life filming locations for 1992's The Muppet Christmas Carol, that movie was shot all within Shepperton Studios in Surrey, there is something of a link to be had with Cathedral Street, as Sir Michael Caine, who plays Scrooge in that much beloved version, was born not too far from here, at the former St Olave's Hospital off of Lower Road in Rotherhithe. His connection with the site is now marked by a plaque. In the 1984 film meanwhile, Scrooge's office, while still chilly, is based in a far more pleasant location, that being Perch's House, a 16th century building which you'll find on Shrewsbury's Windsor Place. After mistaking Bob Cratchit's son, Tiny Tim, for a beggar outside Perch's house, George C. Scott's Scrooge stomps off towards the Royal Exchange, taking a route along Gullett's Passage, where he barges past a group of carol singers. Then, once Bob Cratchit, played here by David Warner, finally finishes work, he comes out to meet Tiny Tim, who asks if they can walk home via Cornhill to watch the people skating. They do this a little further up Windsor Place, outside the former Royal Salop Infirmary, a building which dates from the 1830s and is used here to represent the Royal Exchange. Today it's the Parade Shopping Centre. Did you know, by the way, that Tiny Tim was inspired by a real child, Charles Dickens' disabled nephew, Henry Augustus Burnet, who, just like Tiny Tim, was born in Camden Town, although he spent most of his life in Manchester. Henry would have been 4 years old at the time his uncle wrote A Christmas Carol. Sadly, Henry, who gave Dickens a valuable insight into how those with disabilities struggled during that tough era, died in 1849, aged just 10. He's buried in London's Highgate Cemetery. As the evening draws on, Scrooge has dinner in his usual melancholy tavern before making his way home, his abode being described as a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard where it had no business to be. It's believed Dickens had Lime Street, EC3 in mind when describing this location, and as Scrooge approaches the front door, its knocker morphs into a ghostly vision of Jacob Marley's face. In the 1951 film, the building used as Scrooge's creepy home can be found on Scandrett Street in Wapping. It was the old St John of Wapping charity school, which had closed in 1945, and so was pretty much derelict when Alistair Sim filmed here, although it appears the crew did use the interior for shots as well. Thankfully, the building has since been restored. In the 1984 movie, George C. Scott's Scrooge trudges towards his home, which is located on Belmont, via a path which runs through the graveyard of Old St Chad's Church, which in those days had railings running along either side. Later that night, whilst Scrooge prepares a bowl of gruel, Jacob Marley's chain-rattling ghost makes its alarming appearance, before going on to warn his old partner that it's imperative he seeks redemption if he wishes to avoid a terrible fate. The ghost of Christmas Past is a curious being. Dickens describes it as glowing unbearably bright and appearing like a child, yet not so like a child. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it. The Muppet Christmas Carol does a good job of depicting this eerie phantom, as does the 1999 adaptation, in which the Ghost of Christmas Past is played by the American actor Joel Grey. The first place this spirit takes Scrooge to is his old boarding school, which in the late 90s film is represented by Kirby Hall in Northamptonshire, a partially ruined manor house which dates back to the 1570s and was once owned by Sir Christopher Hatton, the fellow after who London's Hatton Garden is named. In the same film, we also see Scrooge's fellow pupils dashing across this bridge, Ilford Bridge, which crosses the River Nene, and when Scrooge tries to call out, the ghost informs him that they have no consciousness of us. These are but shadows of things that have been. Next, we see Scrooge's younger sister, Fran, come to visit her brother in school. Ebenezer was very fond of Fran, and in the 1999 film, we get to see them together in scenes shot within the interior of Kirby Hall. Fran tells Ebenezer that she's persuaded their father, a usually cold, cruel man, to have him come home for Christmas, and so the pair leave together by horse and carriage via this archway. As they walk through the ruins of Kirby Hall, Scrooge and the ghost discuss Fran, who, it transpires, died young. Although she did have a son, Fred, Scrooge's nephew, a good-hearted soul who, every year, implores his uncle to join him for Christmas dinner, an invitation which Scrooge always bluntly rejects. Once old enough, the young Ebenezer is apprenticed to the kindly Mr. Fezziwig, whose business in the 1951 film is on Cathedral Street, which we saw earlier. When he was young, prospects looked good for Ebenezer. That is until an overzealous attitude towards business began to utterly consume him, a change in character which leads his fiancée, Belle, to break off their long-term engagement. In the 1984 adaptation, the scene in which Belle breaks this sad news was filmed beside this bridge, in the grounds of Attingham Park in Attingham, on the outskirts of Shrewsbury. It's also in Attingham Park, in the stable's courtyard, that the Ghost of Christmas Past shows Belle as having been blessed with a happy family, a painful illustration of what Scrooge has missed out on. In the Muppet Christmas Carol, Belle and Ebenezer's breakup was intended to be shown via a melancholy musical number entitled When Love Is Gone, although when shown to test audiences, this song was deemed far too sad, and so ended up being cut from the original release. Dressed in a billowing green cloak, and embodying the very essence of festive cheer, the Ghost of Christmas Present begins his intervention by taking Ebenezer Scrooge on a stroll through London as it appears on Christmas morning. In the 1984 film, the Ghost, played by Edward Woodward, leads Scrooge through Shrewsbury's main town square and on through the Old Market Hall, a building which, in its present form, dates back to 1597. Another historic building on Shrewsbury Square is the former music hall, now Shrewsbury Museum and Art Gallery. It was here, in May 1852, that Charles Dickens participated in a charity performance of a little-known farce he'd co-written with Mark Lemon, the editor of Punch magazine, entitled Mr. Nightingale's Diary, and on later tours he gave a reading of A Christmas Carol at Shrewsbury Music Hall too. The Ghost of Christmas Present then takes Scrooge to his nephew, Fred's house, to witness the warmth and fun that he's missing out on. In the 1984 film, Fred's home is located on the Crescent town walls. And in the 1999 version, the street used is Gloucester Circus in Greenwich, where Fred is played by young Dominic West. After this, Scrooge is taken to look upon the Cratchit family who live in Camden town, which in Dickens' time was an extremely poor area. Being home to the Cratchits isn't Camden's only connection with the Christmas Carol. This is the Henson, an old warehouse, now apartments, which was once home to Jim Henson's Creature Workshop. It was here that many of the Muppets, which appear in the Muppet Christmas Carol, were lovingly crafted. Sadly, Jim Henson passed away following a sudden illness in 1990. The Muppet Christmas Carol was the first movie made by the studio in the wake of his death, and as such it's dedicated to him, along with Richard Hunt, who worked as a puppeteer on the film, but died in early 1992, aged just 40. Jim Henson is also commemorated by a bench which looks out from Hampstead Heath's Parliament Hill. This seat was originally commissioned by Jim Henson himself, in memory of his friend and colleague, Donald Sarlin, who Jim credited as being the man most responsible for the look of the Muppets. In the 1984 film, the Cratchit's home is located on the corner of Fish Street and Bear Steps. An incredibly atmospheric place, I think you'll agree. And can you see the mock-up of St Paul's Cathedral in the distance? In reality, this view looks towards the spire of St Julian's. Although the ghost of Christmas Present is a cheerful soul, his haunting soon takes a dark turn. "My life upon this globe is very brief," he tells Scrooge as he begins to grow old and grey. "It ends tonight." The ghost concludes by revealing something hideous to Scrooge. 2 feral children hidden beneath his cloak, which Dickens uses to hammer home the book's social message. "They are manned," the spirit declares, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree." In 1999, this disturbing scene was shot at the Chatham Dockyard in Kent, whilst the 1984 location is even creepier. It takes place amongst the arches beneath the Severn Bridge railway junction, just south of Shrewsbury station. On this note, the ghost of Christmas Present vanishes, abandoning Scrooge in this unsettling place, although he's not alone for long, for he's soon joined beneath the arches by the most ominous of all the spirits, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Charles Dickens describes the last of the spirits as being shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing visible, save one outstretched hand. Yet, despite its eyes being hidden, Scrooge can feel the spirit staring intently at him. Its mysterious presence, Dickens tells us, filled the miser with solemn dread. In the story, the first place this ghastly entity leads Scrooge to is back to the Royal Exchange, where he overhears his colleagues joke about a recent death, the deceased of course being Ebenezer himself. In the 1984 film, the Royal Exchange is represented by the Old Royal Salop Infirmary, which we saw earlier when Tiny Tim watched folks skating outside here. The 1999 version, meanwhile, uses the Old Royal Naval College in Greenwich. Moving on, the ghost of Christmas yet to come leads Scrooge to a grim hovel, where a pawnbroker named Old Joe is haggling with a woman, played here by Liz Smith, over his meagre possessions. In the 1984 film, the location used for this sordid little place is behind the Nag's Head on Wall Cop, a pub which has a history dating back to the 16th century. Wildcop is also home to the Lion Hotel, where Dickens himself stayed at least twice, his first visit being in 1838, and another recorded 20 years later in 1858, when he wrote a letter to one of his daughters in which he described his room and the view from the window. "We have the strangest little rooms, the ceilings of which I can touch with my hand. The windows bulge out over the street as if they were stern windows on a ship. A door opens out of the sitting room onto a little open gallery, where one leans over a queer old rail and looks all downhill and slantwise at the crookedest black and yellow houses, all manner of shapes, except straight shapes." The pair then return to the Cratchit's home, where, in this wretched potential reality, it transpires that Tiny Tim has passed away. In his final ordeal, the ghost hauls Ebenezer to a graveyard where he's forced to gaze upon his own tombstone. In the 1951 film, this appears to be the old burial ground of St John's Church on Scandrett Street, which is located opposite the derelict school used for Scrooge's home. And in the George C. Scott version, the graveyard used is that of St Chad's. The gravestone used in this scene was an ancient one, the original name having long worn away, and so the film crew recarved it with Scrooge's name. Once filming was complete, this headstone was left in situ, thus making it a popular tourist attraction. Unbelievably, just a few weeks before filming this video, one moron, or morons, thought it would be fun to smash this little landmark into several pieces. Fortunately, a local company called Midland Masonry stepped in to repair the stone for free, so total kudos to them. As for whoever was responsible for this senseless damage in the first place though, well, all I can say is I hope that, just like Scrooge, they eventually come to realise just how despicable they are. Following his enlightening, albeit traumatic experience, Ebenezer Scrooge is a changed man, and flings open the window to welcome Christmas morning. In the Alistair Sim film, we get an interior view of his home on Scandrett Street as he hurries to the window, and when he pops his head out, it appears to be from one of the frames on the upper story. In the 1984 film, George C. Scott does the same at his home on Belmont. Scrooge then calls down to a passing boy, offering him a shilling, or half a crown if he's quicker, to fetch a prize turkey for Bob Cratchit's family, which, when Dickens envisioned this scene, would have involved a quick dash to Leadenhall Market. Once the turkey has been dispatched by cab to the Cratchits in Camden, Scrooge heads off to spend the day with his nephew Fred, allowing us to see again the locations used in Shrewsbury and Greenwich, this time in broad daylight. The final shot of the 1984 film was taken on Shrewsbury's Fish Street, complete with the St Paul's mock-up. Whilst in a 1951 film, the location used was Old Barrack Yard, just off of Knightsbridge, which we see as the narrator quotes the book's closing words, telling us that, of Scrooge, "It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one." Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tour of the locations used in various versions of A Christmas Carol, and as always, I'd be delighted to hear your own thoughts. Are you familiar with any of these locations? Which film do you think best captures the essence of Dickens' festive tale? And are there any similar locations which you can think of? If so, please be sure to let me know in the comments. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, would ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus, of course, it'd be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.